Hello, everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two before we start. We have folks joining. Okay, I'm sure we'll have a few more folks joining us, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Spring CESU, that is Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit webinar series. My name is Lisa Gerloff and I am the Executive Director for the Rocky Mountains CESU. This year with this series, we have the Colorado Plateau and the Desert Southwest joining us. Each of our CESUs has selected a project and researcher to showcase the diverse range of good science that is accomplished through our regional networks and the impact it has on management decisions. The Rocky Mountains will be kicking off the seminar series today, but before I do an introduction of our speaker, I want to share what is coming up. So in a couple weeks, on March 25th, the Colorado Plateau will be represented by Dr. Tamilian Sankey from Northern Arizona University. She will give a presentation titled LiDAR-Derived Fuels Monitoring. And then looking to April 23rd, Mallory Davies from the University of Arizona will give a presentation Thinking Diet, Migration, and PD Invasion Risk, a decade of long-nosed bat research in the desert Southwest. In a few minutes, I'll put a link to our webinar page in the chat box. If you have interest in attending these other two presentations, and we hope that you do, you'll be able to register from that page. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today, Hayley Johnson. Hayley received her undergraduate degree in natural resource conservation at Virginia Tech. She realized, though, that she is most interested in the human side of public land. Hayley moved to Missoula to pursue a master's degree in parks, tourism, and recreation management, bridging that gap between natural resources and the visitor experience. She graduated in May 2025, but continues to work in Dr. Will Rice's Wildland and Recreation Management Lab here at the University of Montana. Hayley is the recipient of the 2025 Rocky Mountain CESU Student Award for her outstanding work on the projects that she will be sharing with you today. Hayley will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and we will have plenty of time at the end for questions. So Hayley, I gladly turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Let me go ahead and share my screen, which hopefully you all can see that okay. And I will pump out of there. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of the webinar series, and just giving me the opportunity to share more about some of these projects that went into the student award that I received. Today, I'm really excited to share a bit more about social science and visitor use management on public lands, especially in light of increased demand for outdoor recreation on our federal public lands here in the American West over the last few years. And so, oh, let's see what happens. All right. So over the last several years, we've seen a boom or a major uptick in outdoor recreation participation, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. This chart here, it's from the most recent annual report from the Outdoor Industry Association, an organization that shares annual trends in outdoor recreation in the United States. And in 2024, the U.S. saw 181.1 million participants, or about 58.6% of all Americans ages 6 and older participated in outdoor recreation activities. And these increases in outdoor recreation, especially the concerns that come along with this boom in recreating on public lands, like our national parks, our national forests, have been well documented in popular media as well over the last several years. And so as you can see here from these headlines, concerns over crowding and loving the parks to death through resource degradation in places that might be understaffed or strapped for resources is a repeated concern. And these federal lands, they're charged with this dual mandate or a multiple use mandate where these agencies, they have to find a reasonable balance between managing for multiple priorities. So for example, in the National Park Service, they're charged with preserving the natural, historical, and cultural resources for future generations while also providing high quality visitor experiences and access to those resources at the same time. Or thinking about the Forest Service needing to balance forestry activity needs while also providing recreational access to quality opportunities. And so over the last several years, there have been several management frameworks that have been created to help guide agency management decisions on helping them find this balance between recreational use and resource protection. And so in 2011, the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council was created to develop best practices for visitor use management. And in 2016, they released their framework to provide managers of federal lands and waters guidance with a common approach to visitor use management, which they have defined as the proactive and adaptive process for managing characteristics of visitor use in the natural and managerial setting. And so while I was a master's student at the University of Montana, I had the opportunity to work as a research assistant with federal partners from both the National Park Service and the Forest Service on multiple projects that focused on visitor use management challenges, which I will walk us through a few of those today. The first of those is this one, building a conceptual understanding of managed access across the recreation opportunity spectrum. So with the National Park Service, they have not escaped the pressures of increased demand for outdoor experiences. According to the agency's most recent data in 2024, the agency saw a record high 331.9 million recreation visits in 2024, and these visits are becoming more spread throughout the year, not just necessarily in peak season use. So about 55% of parks experienced an above average number of visits between February and June and October and December, so during that off season. As well as 38 parks experienced visitation above the 10-year average in every month of the year. And so as more and more people desire to visit national parks in the US, managers must make critical visitor use management decisions to support their mission of preserving these enjoyable visitor experiences, along with protecting the natural and cultural resources that, sustain and provide those recreation experiences. And so to do this, they've implemented several managed access systems over the past few years, which they have defined as a suite of tools to help pace the timing and volume of visitation into areas to optimize access, ensure quality experiences, and protect resources. And so some examples of these include some of the recent piloted timed entry or vehicle reservation systems to international parks like Glacier, Rocky Mountains, Arches, which I should mention this project was specifically done in the fall of 2023, where there were several of these systems that existed within these parks, but many of those have actually undergone some very recent changes that will go into effect this summer, and it might look a bit different now. But these managed access systems aren't necessarily a new idea. The systems have existed for a while when we think about permits for wilderness recreation or backcountry camping experiences and having to make reservations for front country camping. And so, although managed access is often referred to in this singular form, like an individual backpacking permit system or an individual park entrance fee, our project team, as they were conceptualizing this project, they hypothesized that managed access more accurately exists within a layered system of managing recreation access, where a visitor must navigate through several forms of managed access in order to get to an individual recreation experience. And this can be seen through the example of navigating a wilderness backpacking backcountry camping experience. So to quickly walk through this example, someone who might want to go backpacking in a national park during the pre-trip planning phase, they might need to enter an early access lottery system on recreation.gov to hopefully get awarded early access to the backpacking permits. But then they actually have to go into rec.gov and reserve the campsites for that permit on their desired trip days and acquire administratively required safety gear, such as a bear can or bear spray if that's required in that park. And then when the person actually gets to the park, they will likely have to pay an entrance fee or show their interagency pass, and then still go to the Wilderness Information Center to pick up their physical backcountry permit that they need to take with them. And then when they drive to the trailhead, they still have to find parking, and when they actually get onto their backcountry trip, while they're out there, they still have to follow all leave no trace regulations, which might pertain to campfires and food storage. And so these are just a smattering of managed access hoops that a visitor might have to jump through in theory to get to an actual backpacking camping experience in the backcountry of a national park. But in addition to having to know how to navigate through each of these hoops, the visitor experience is increasingly complicated by the growing universe of managed access systems and terms that vary from park to park or vary from recreation experience to experience. So for example, needing an entrance pass to get into the park, which means paying an entrance fee, as well as possibly needing a vehicle reservation or a timed entry reservation to be able to enter the park during a designated time window. And so there are a lot of different forms of recreation access management that can be a bit confusing to navigate for the visitor, especially when some of the terms can be used interchangeably, something like a permit versus a pass versus a reservation. And so the purpose of this project was to really create a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about managed access, and to design a conceptual framework to outline possible management decisions within managed access tools, and then to visualize how these decisions may impact a visitor experience across the recreation opportunity spectrum. So thinking about not only backpacking, but in maybe a wilderness setting, but also thinking about accessing a front country opportunity in a more developed area as well. And so for some of our methods here, it was definitely a collaborative effort. We had several researchers between the University of Montana, the Forest Service's Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and the National Park Service's Social Science Office. We all worked together on this project pretty collaboratively throughout each phase. We met frequently over Zoom over the course of a semester. This was part of my first semester of grad school doing this project. And so we would meet every so often to talk about project updates, but we would also be in communication as we were collecting this information and sharing it with each other over email. And I was definitely working closely with the people here at the University of Montana and Ulrey to run through some of these things. But for our data sources that we were using, we browsed through the most relevant online material to understand these different things and these different tools that were being used for managed access in the agency. And so we looked at different things like the public-facing websites, like an individual park unit's website, understanding their visitor use management strategy, if they had reservations or permits, how they were being talked about to the public on their website, and then also on recreation.gov, where the visitor was actually going to secure that permit, and how on recreation.gov, they also had a glossary of terms that would help bring some definitions to a user of all these different things that they were trying to, or all the different things and sources they were seeing on rec.gov. And then we also looked at the National Park Service's Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website, looking through news releases about different systems that were being put in place, or even some of their planning documents if they talked about visitor use management, as well as the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council's framework. They had talked about some of these things and broke down definitions and provided some examples of these different terms that they were using, as well as scoping existing literature on recreation management practices with recreation allocation and rationing techniques. And so what I was looking for and what our team was looking for as we dug through these sources were the different terms that were being used and the definitions that were given to them if they were explicitly defined, how they were being described to the public, and looking for similarities among these terms and words that could sometimes be used interchangeably by the agency or by the park unit. And we were recording this into this big Excel that was shared among our collaborators and worked together to narrow our terms down to singular definitions based on how they were being used and defined by the agency. And so we came up with this glossary of defined recreation access management terms and provided examples of how those terms had been used by the agency and provided some synonyms for how they maybe had been used interchangeably at times as well. And so we divided our glossary up into indirect management terms, which are different ways of indirectly managing visitor behavior through actions such as providing educational programming on leave no trace principles, or by physically altering a site, or designing the site to be more resistant to visitor impacts, as well as direct management terms, where the managers were directly managing visitor use by implementing regulations such as prohibiting campfires in fire-restricted areas, or things like setting use limits and requiring permits to protect potentially a sensitive area like a high alpine meadow. But this here is an example of a potentially tricky term that has potential to be confusing among all these other access management terms. So here we have a permit, which we determined to be a physical document allowing a visitor to use a government facility, enter a specific area, or participate in an activity. But where it gets confusing is how other terms like reservations and passes can also be used in the same manner. And so a visitor might be unsure of whether they need a permit, or do they need a reservation or a pass to go recreate somewhere. And sometimes it really depends. Sometimes you might need all three in order to get to a specific activity. And so the point, though, for us wasn't necessarily for our team to come up with suggestions for the individual words that the agency should be using. Instead, it was really to start drawing more attention to how complicated these systems are and to help the agency start thinking more about how they're communicating this information with the public. And so then we created this recreation access management framework or model, or really just a visualization of all the various options that a manager might have at their disposal when choosing to implement recreation access management prescriptions in order to manage visitor access to opportunities within a park unit. But then we also took these ideas and visually mapped these different options across the recreation opportunity spectrum to visualize how these systems might look different or impact the visitor experience differently, depending on the type of recreation experience that they're interested in. And so I kind of already walked us through briefly the backcountry camping experience, but fairly similarly, this is the experience for a front country camper. You're still possibly navigating a reservation system and getting your required gear, going to the park, maybe still having to check in with the campground office to receive your little tag for your car to be able to camp in that site. And then you're still following all of the required campground regulations while you're out there as well. And then here for the day hikers, perhaps we see it's maybe fewer hoops that a person might have to jump through, but it still can be complicated if you do need a vehicle reservation or a timed entry permit to get into the park, which it's just interesting to think about, because day hiking in a national park it seems like it's pretty straightforward to just go out there for a nice hike, but it can become more complicated depending on the different systems or hoops that a visitor might have to jump through. And so we took all of this information and we shared it among our team of collaborators to really visualize visualize how recreation access management might look different across these experiences and how it might be increasingly complicated for the visitor to navigate, especially for different experiences that they might see at various park units across the agency. It really looks a bit different depending on where you are. But for me, working as a graduate research assistant, this project was really a good introduction to visitor use management during my first semester of graduate school. I think these things that I was researching through the agency paired really well to what I was learning in some of my classes on parks and protected area management and thinking about other visitor use management frameworks. And it gave me a really solid foundation of these things to be able to explore in some of my own personal research interests in managed access systems on public lands. And so the area that I became particularly interested in exploring further with my thesis research was the allocation of recreation opportunities on public lands. And so with that, that takes us to our second project, which is really my thesis, and focusing on the investigation of recreation rationing and camping access through the lens of access theory, which I did as like a case study in the rural American West. But first, to really break down recreation allocation specifically, as we've been discussing, recreation allocation is just one of many different management options that managers have in their toolkit for managing visitor use on public lands. So in response to increased demand for recreation opportunities on public lands, managers may at times choose to implement a use limit or a visitor capacity in order to protect or conserve the natural resources or the visitor experience. And so they do this by limiting the number of people on the landscape or in the area, but a use limit can also exist in a more physical capacity way due to the nature of a finite resource. For example, a parking lot or a developed campground. There's only so many parking spots at any given trailhead, and therefore a finite number of people are allowed to use that resource at any given time. And when these limits to access exist, public land managers must then determine, well, how are they going to distribute that access to these limited public recreation opportunities? And so the way we think about allocation is that it's divided up into two different things. First is allotment, which is distributing these opportunities between different sectors or groups. So thinking about commercial or non-commercial use in an area, or even thinking about you could allot differently between in-state residents versus out-of-state residents. But on the flip side, or on the other side of that, we have rationing, which is specifically distributing access within an individual group or between individual users like you and me. And so if you have ever tried to get a backpacking permit or made a reservation for camping, you've actually engaged with the recreation rationing system. And so the focus of the remainder of the presentation is going to be specifically on the rationing side of things. But a really good area to examine recreation rationing on public lands is through the context of front country camping, or what we might think of as car camping in tents, trailers, campers, in developed campgrounds. And that's because of how important and ubiquitous this activity is on North American public lands, especially in the US. So camping is the second fastest growing outdoor recreation activity in North America. About 67% of North American residents report camping at least occasionally, and then 53 million US and Canadian households camp on an annual basis. So we have a lot of people going camping. There's really high demand for those experiences. But similar to parking lots, these developed campgrounds are a good example of a scarce, finite recreation resource. There's only so many given campsites within any given campground to meet that high demand of camping interest. So naturally, not everyone will have the ability to access a campsite, particularly in a popular campground like you might find at a national park. And so in response to that demand, campground managers must then decide how they are going to ration or distribute access to these camping opportunities. And so some early suggestions for rationing were to just increase the price of camping to manage manage demand, like you might see in a market-based system. But this demonstrated an early disregard for power, equity, and justice in campsite allocation thinking. Not everybody can maybe afford to pay a high price to go participate in that, and we're thinking about these activities happening on public lands. And so arguably, those ideas are still ingrained within these systems, but fortunately, because they were thinking about public lands, managers weren't necessarily swayed by these influences, and mostly non-market means of rationing campsites were chosen. So today, most of our front country campsites on public lands are distributed through walk-up permits or first come, first serve systems. You show up, and if the campsite's open, you can camp there, or through online advanced reservation systems or like recreation.gov and other agency websites where you can reserve your campsite in advance of your trip. But the challenge in this is that these rationing decisions are value-based judgments that are individually made by managers themselves. And so noted 35 years ago by Dr. Bo Shelby, who has done quite a bit of research on the topic of recreation allocation, is that crucial elements of the rationing systems are basically accidents of history that have had major unintended consequences. And so there's potential that some of these unintended consequences are for who gets to have access and how these systems might affect people's ability to gain access to these recreation opportunities. And so regardless of the technique that's chosen by a public land manager, each of these decisions are made by individuals that come with a set of trade-offs regarding equity and access. And while these trade-offs between equity and rationing decisions have been noted before, they're not empirically well understood at this time. And so these trade-offs are some of what I was specifically interested in researching and exploring through my thesis project. And so that is what I did. I explored this through the theoretical lens of access theory. And this theory, it was introduced in 2003 by Ribot and Peluso, and access theory has had very limited application in the outdoor recreation realm, but it is used quite commonly in the fields of political ecology and human geography studies as a way to better understand people's relationships and access to land and natural resources and their livelihoods that are based in or rooted in these resources. And so what I really liked about this theory is the author's definition of what access is, where they're really focusing on access being the ability to derive benefit from things rather than the right to benefit from things. And so within our context of camping on public lands in the rural American West, in theory, all recreation activities are available or should be available to everyone to participate in, and therefore everyone has the right to go camping on public lands. But their ability to do so has been limited by a number of things, such as having enough free time to go on a camping trip, having all the right equipment to take to your campsite, in addition to having to navigate through these management hoops that we were talking about earlier, like a campsite rationing system, making a reservation for a campsite in advance, paying the park fees, and then following all campground regulations while they're there, potentially among some of the other things. And so for my thesis, my research was really focused on these two specific questions. The first was thinking about access mechanisms, which is a term that comes from access theory. The question was about what are the mechanisms of access, or really the things or the pathways that help enable campers to access front country camping in our context of the rural American West. And then my second question was focused on rationing and access. So taking what we learned in question 1, these different mechanisms of access, the pathways to camping, are they different for campers who are camping in first come, first serve based campsites or compared to campers in advanced reservation-based campsites? And so my study site was Curacanti National Recreation Area, located in Gunnison, Colorado, or Southwest Colorado. At Curacanti, there are 10 developed campgrounds with a total of 380 campsites available for camping. And some of our larger campgrounds down there, like Elk Creek and Lake Fork that you see on those maps, those had reservations available to secure camping in advance. They would open up 6 months in advance. But all other campsites in the recreation area were available available on a first come, first served basis. And so I focused specifically on Elk Creek and Stevens Creek campgrounds because they represented the two different rationing strategies that I was interested in examining. So Elk Creek had those reservations that you could make up to 6 months in advance, and Stevens Creek, all campsites were secured on a first come, first served basis. So they weren't reserved in advance. And I collected all of my data using a survey with a drop-off pickup methodology. So I would intercept campers in the early evening hours while they were in their campsite, and I would talk to them a little bit about my project. And if they wanted to participate, I would drop off a survey for them to fill out at their earliest convenience during their trip. And then I would ask them to put it in the envelope and clip it to their campsite post like you see in this photo here, so that I could walk back around at a later point, like the next day, and could still collect their survey after they had left. And so on my survey, I had some questions about camping access, thinking about maybe some potential constraints that they might face, like not having the equipment or not being able to afford the equipment to go camping, or struggling to navigate the campsite booking process, as well as things that might help enable them to go camping, such as growing up camping with family or having family and friends to go camping with them. And so these questions were adapted from previous leisure or outdoor recreation constraints research, which is a well-developed field, to adapt them more to this access theory to see if we could really use this theory to look at these challenges in a different light, through a different lens. And so then again, we had these two different rationing strategies of our first come, first served campsites and our reservation-based campsites. And because this was more of an exploratory study to see if we could use this novel lens of access theory, I ran an exploratory factor analysis on my newly created survey questions. The factor analysis successfully factored our survey items down into their predicted buckets of access mechanisms based on our understanding of access theory compared to outdoor recreation constraints research. And so from our results, we got 6 unique access mechanisms or pathways that help enable or help people to gain access to camping opportunities at Curacanti. And so these are things like technology, relations, identity, capital, knowledge, and rights. And so here we see some of our questions and the actual stats behind this, but these were the questions that we were asking on the survey. And so questions that ended up factoring down into the technology realm were about that process of booking a campsite and having the technology like fast enough internet speed to get that reservation in advance. And then thinking about social relations, whether that's having family or friends to go camping with, and others that you see here. And so beyond this factor analysis and seeing whether or not our survey worked and we could use this access theory in this new way in our context of camping, I also wanted to see whether or not any of these categories or pathways were particularly helpful or maybe not as helpful in helping a camper to gain access to camping. And so I created composite variables for each of these categories, essentially by taking an average of the averages, response to each question from each category, and then cross-compared the categories or access mechanisms to each other. And so I found that the most enabling pathways to camping access in our context were knowledge and technology, so understanding how to navigate the campsite booking process or having the camping skills to go camping were among the most helpful or the most enabling pathways, while social identity, or people maybe identifying themselves as campers or feeling like camping is a big part of who they are, was perhaps not quite as helpful or as important in helping them to gain access. And then for my second research question, which was focused specifically on the rationing systems, comparing first come, first serve campsites to reservation-based campsites, what I found was that first come, first served campers reported having greater technology-related challenges. So perhaps they struggled to navigate that online booking platform on rec.gov, or they just didn't want to have to deal with that, is what a lot of people told me. They didn't want to have to go make a reservation on rec.gov, which might suggest why they were staying in a first come, first served campsite to begin with. But on the other side, our reservation-based campers reported having more constrained pathways through social relations and social identity. So perhaps feeling, right, like camping doesn't necessarily play as significant of a role in their lives, and possibly it was more difficult, to go camping with other people because it can be harder to coordinate multiple schedules in advance when you're trying to make your reservation. But to me, our results suggest that regardless of the rationing system that is chosen, there's always going to be this set of trade-offs regarding people's ability to gain access to camping through that rationing system. So reservations might require navigating that technology and coordinating schedules with others in advance, which can be difficult. But also our first come, first serve systems may require people to be more go with the flow and have backup plans for if they show up to a campground that's full. Some people might not be prepared for that, or they might not want to have to deal with those what if it's full scenarios. And so this suggests that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to campsite rationing. Maybe there's some opportunity here to have multiple rationing systems in place within a given recreation area or within a given campground. We could have reservations within the campground for some of our campsites, but still saving some sites for those first come, first serve people who might not want or be able to navigate that rec.gov system. And with these trade-offs, I believe that it's important to use social science then as a tool to gather input from the visitors themselves on their perspectives and their preferences for these rationing systems to better learn from those who are actually going to be impacted by the implementation of a certain rationing strategy. And so having this data can allow managers to make better rationing decisions on public lands that serves a broader swath of the public. And that's exactly what we've been doing at the University of Montana in the Wildland and Recreation Management Lab. Over the past several years in the WARM Lab, we've been collecting data on visitor preferences for rationing, recreation rationing techniques across several different wildland recreation settings and contexts and throughout time. And so I'll share a little bit more about that as well. And so we've collected this data in various locations, primarily in the Western US, by surveying visitors out in the field. And most of this data was collected pretty recently, over the summers of 2023 and 2024. And most of it, though, it wasn't these projects were a part of other things that were already ongoing in these areas. They weren't necessarily for the particular purpose of being able to compare rationing preferences across contexts. However, the lab has been asking similar questions in each of these locations, and so we've been sitting on some really good data that does allow us to explore our interests in these rationing systems a bit further. And so in 2023, Grand Canyon National Park campers were surveyed by some of my colleagues in the lab. And then in 2024, I helped survey some of our Curacanti National Recreation Area campers, our Yellowstone visitors, and then our North Cascades boaters and wilderness backpackers. And originally, we were just going to do some comparisons across these 4 samples, but then we were also interested in broadening our context to include data from early wilderness recreation allocation studies that occurred in 1969. And so we actually utilized archive data from the Forest Service Research Data Archive, which you can see the website here. The QR code here will actually take you to the data set that we incorporated into this project. But there are a lot of really interesting data sets out there, so I highly recommend checking it out and then also uploading your own data to it for the long-term use and the future use to be able to compare trends data like we've done here with this study. But as I mentioned, this data was originally collected in 1969 and included in a research paper written in 1973 by George Stenke, examining visitor perceptions of wilderness recreation, carrying capacity, and asking those same questions of visitors back in 1969 in different areas that we've been asking today in the WARM Lab. And so this allowed us to add 3 additional contexts to our little project here. So we have canoeing in the Boundary Waters canoe area in area wilderness, and then backpacking in the Bridger Wilderness and the High Uintas Primitive area, which is now a designated wilderness area. But within some of these contexts, visitors were asked to rate on a scale of strongly opposed to strongly support their rationing preferences for distributing access to their respective recreation opportunities. This includes most of the sites that I just went through on the map, minus Cure-Conti, because rationing preferences weren't necessarily a part of my original thesis study. So unfortunately, I didn't ask those questions. However, all of these other locations included questions on visitor preferences for each rationing technique. So thinking about first come, first served systems, advanced reservations, and online lotteries. And some of the newer areas, not the ones that were done in 1969, but in 2023 and 2024, we also included some questions about how visitors feel about a combination of these techniques and a combination of timeframes to release advanced reservations. And then we also included in these surveys questions that asked visitors to report their preferred and maximum booking windows, or how far in advance that visitors would prefer or would be willing to book a reservation for any given recreation activity. And so this is a bit of a newer question, and so we have only asked that in Grand Canyon, North Cascades, Yellowstone, and Cure-Conti. And so unfortunately, we don't have this data from 1969, but we were still able to do some comparisons across these 4 groups. And so because we've been sitting on these different data sets collected over the last few years, our lab was interested in exploring whether these rationing preferences or booking window preferences are different between different recreation contexts. And so as just a little bit of a side quest for our team, we combined these data sets to run analyses on visitor responses to our questions across each wildland recreation setting. And so for time's sake, I'm only going to discuss one example of a rationing preference. I chose the lottery because I thought it'd be interesting to focus on because a randomized lottery system is perhaps a more fair way of distributing recreation access, and because we can see some interesting differences between visitor perspectives here. So clearly, lotteries are not perceived as positively as by everyone. Lotteries were most supported by the Boundary Waters, Bridger Wilderness, and Hayuwintas Wilderness users, which was our data from 1969, which is interesting because if we look at our wilderness users that we surveyed in 2024 in the North Cascades, we see that it's not as strongly favored by them today. So perhaps these wilderness backpackers' perspectives have changed at least a little bit regarding a lottery over the last several decades. And we can also see that our Yellowstone visitors were the least supportive of a lottery system for day use access, as well as Grand Canyon National Park campers. They weren't necessarily supportive of a lottery for camping access. And so this variety of perspectives were also seen across other rationing techniques as well, but this was just a really interesting one to focus on more specifically. But moving on to research question 2, looking at the booking window preferences, where we asked visitors to share how far in advance they'd be willing or would prefer to book a reservation for their recreation experience. We also see a lot of variation in the data here, which you can tell by the widespread of the data within these plots across our samples. And so Yellowstone visitors expressed the largest booking window for booking reservations to visit the park. On average, they said their preferred booking window was 2.71 months with a standard deviation of 3 months, followed by Grand Canyon campers' booking window for campsites. Their preferred window was 2.5 months, with about 2.5 months of a standard deviation, compared to the shortest preferred booking window, which came from our campers at Cure-Conti National Recreation Area, who preferred an average booking window of 1.21 months. And so I think this is interesting because we're asking visitors who are participating in the exact same activity, camping, yet in vastly different places. So Grand Canyon, it's this iconic natural wonder of the world, drawing in perhaps a lot of international visitors compared to Cure-Conti, which is drawing in more of the local visitors, perhaps those from the state of Colorado. And so these visitors are different and they have different preferences and needs for how far in advance they might be planning their trip to camp in these respective national park units. But so what does any of this mean? What can we take away from all of this? Well, not surprisingly, we can find again that rationing systems are truly context dependent, which harkens us back to a point made long ago by Elwood Schaefer about the average camper that doesn't exist. So our results suggest again that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to managing visitor demand across these contexts. Each site, they have their own unique situation, their own unique recreation activities, and their own unique visitors. And so by adding in this archive data as well, we can start to see that maybe there are some shifts happening across time as well for visitors' perspectives on these rationing systems. And so what I think is really important to take away from this here is that our results illustrate the need for these rationing systems to be tailor-made to each specific context, and that it's important to gather information from the visitors' perspectives prior to making management decisions about recreation access to different recreation opportunities. And so to wrap everything up here today, I just wanted to share a few things that I feel like I personally learned and took away from my experience as a student working all of these different research projects. First, collaboration on all of these projects with federal partners is key. Working together as partners between the university and managers in the field can be really successful if there's buy-in from both sides. So I saw that most of the work on these projects really did involve collaborations with our folks in the field, whether it was from the study design and the data collection process, and sometimes having managers find staff to be able to assist with the data collection in the field, to the final parts of sharing the results and the co-production of information for what all of this could really mean for the different management sites on the ground. And so having this buy-in from the agency partners creates a higher chance of seeing our results get implemented on the ground, allowing our research to be really impactful. And so then along those lines too, from my student perspective, I found it impactful on my own life to get this practical hands-on experience. And so I think working on a variety of projects helped me to become a better researcher, gain insight to what it might actually look like, to see these challenges on the ground in a variety of contexts. And I think in a way, it's also helped me become a better visitor, perhaps maybe a more sympathetic visitor who understands that there isn't always a straightforward solution to some of these complicated management challenges, especially dealing with increased visitor use. And so finally, my final takeaway is that there's always more work, there's always more research to be done, and I mean that in the most fun, positive, and exciting way. This third project that I shared, as I said, it was a bit of a side quest for me and my collaborators, and it still is. You know, we're still meeting and talking about it, and there was other data that we collected last summer that we're going to be able to add into it, and starting to look at more analyses to see if we can look at other factors that might predict support for these things. But it's all just really cool to see how these projects spark other ideas for more of this kind of research, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of it over the last few years, and hopeful to just continue to explore it more in the future. And so with that, I will wrap up and thank you all so much again for the opportunity to share about these projects. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Drs. Will Rice and Chris Armitage for nominating me for the CESU Student Award for all of this work. It was a nice surprise to receive this year. And this whole process has just been really fun to reflect on all of how all of these different projects and things that I've been working on, how they've all come together to paint this one picture. So with that, I think we can open it up for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Haley. You're definitely well deserving of the CESU Student Award. As promised, we do have some time for questions. And if you have questions, I'm going to ask you to type them into the chat box. And while you are doing that, I'll kick off with a question. So Haley, I had a student that I spent a day with last summer who was doing an internship in developed rec on the Seeley Lake Ranger District on the Lolo National Forest here in Montana. And most of the time was spent visiting the campgrounds that they managed. And in our conversation, it came kind of the reservation system came up for campsites. And one thing that came up was kind of the way locals felt about the reservation system, because they felt like it restricted their access. So I'm wondering if you saw that similar in your survey responses, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Lisa, that's a really good question and point to bring up. I actually did briefly do a couple of the same surveys in the Lolo National Forest and some of the Seeley Lake campgrounds as well, because there was a moment where we thought I wasn't going to get enough data in County to do my analysis, but we ended up not needing to use it. So I feel like I talked with some of those visitors there too, and got to hear some of that from their perspective. But I think it was similar in County, which is why we were going to possibly use Lolo National Forest data because we felt like it was a similar area to be able to compare results. But yes, I feel like County does bring in a lot of locals too, even from Gunnison, Colorado, and it's about 20-minute drive from the town there. And so it does feel like they expressed that it felt like it would restrict their freedom to, drive on a whim down to County to have to make a reservation in advance. Thankfully, there, which is a little bit different than on the Lolo, there wasn't as much of high demand for camping, and so it was easier for them to go and just make those last minute plans. But I know that is definitely a sentiment that people express to me in Colorado as well. And it's definitely something to factor in, which is why I think it's important, even in some of the Lolo campgrounds, they do save some of those loops within a campground for first come, first serve to be able to also serve some of those people as well.
Thanks, Hayley. So we do have a question here in the chat. How have managers responded to your results?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, as a lot of these things, they take time. Management decisions and things, especially in the government, they take time to see things be implemented. But I do think from some of the work, I was talking to my advisor, Will, about some of this earlier, of some of the other work and stuff that the Warm Lab has done and how managers have responded to it. And a good example of that is the Colorado National Monument for their, I think it's the Saddlehorn Campground. We've actually seen them change how some of their rationing strategies within that campground. So they've actually implemented this spectrum of rationing strategies. So having some of the campground loops be available in advance reservations, kind of like I was just talking about with your question, Lisa, but having one loop available for advanced reservations, say several months in advance, but then another loop that opens up 2 months in advance, and then another loop that actually opens up the day of. And so we've been able to see a few different sites be inspired by some of these findings to change some of the rationing strategies like that. And then hopefully also we will start to see some adjustments in those booking windows, like the Saddlehorn Campground, but to have multiple booking windows to allow those people who want the flexibility of not having to book so far in advance, but also needing to book further in advance. And for some of those bigger parks like Grand Canyon, with international visitors making really far in advance plans to travel out there. And I guess I should say too, with this last slide that's still up, the QR code there takes you to the Warm Labs website. And there's some really good information about all of these different projects and stuff that we've helped out with, and then also like different publications and news about some of the other ways that the results from our research has been implemented in these spaces.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Hayley, if so, start typing in the chat box so I can see. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions because you were so thorough. Thank you, Hayley.
I had a lot to say.
Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, all of you in the audience for logging on and being part of our webinar. You may have noticed that this presentation is being recorded, and the Teams webinar series will automatically send you a link to the recording in a day or two. We'll also be posting this recording on our seminar page on the Rocky Mountain CSU website. And I hope to see you again at our next two seminars. Right, and again, thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah.